Last week we tackled all the weird rules of Fazbear Frights and the FNAF world in general. The duality of Remnant and Agony, how people can be turned into street signs and things like that. But even though we talked at length about the how, we never got to the who. Who are the major players of these stories, at least the ones that seem most relevant to the game timeline? Or most pertinently, which Fazbear Frights characters are most likely to be involved in the game's timeline? So we should probably talk about that. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. Super briefly this time. If you did not watch last week's video, you do not have to yet, but just be super clear here. I talked a lot more about this in last week's video. Scott uses the terms canon, continuity, and in connection very loosely. As far as the Fazbear Frights go, all he said were that some of the books are directly connected to the games and others aren't. So we have to take everything on a case-by-case basis. I go more in depth than that last week. But as far as characters go, one of the most important ones is probably one that we already know, William Afton. One of the Fazbear Frights stories, The Man in Room 1280, is often argued to be one of the most directly connected to the game's stories that Fazbear Frights provides. And I see why, but to be clear, if this story is one-to-one with what happens in the games, then like half of Fazbear Frights is as well, and we'll get into it. The Man in Room 1280 describes a burnt beyond belief corpse of a man that is somehow clinging to life. The hospital has tried to euthanize him to put him out of his misery, and they just can't kill this guy. He also seems to emanate evil energy, and everyone is creeped out being around him. Not to mention a few of the times they try to kill the guy, this small boy with curly black hair and an alligator mask keeps popping up to scare them, but they can never catch him. Eventually, following up on a clue that the body gave them, a priest that was called to the hospital ends up taking the Man in Room 1280 to a Fazbear distribution center. And the moment they're inside, the body begins to convulse and then explodes in a black, tarish goo onto several nearby Fazbear animatronic things. Some of them just objects, some full-on animatronics. And it was in that moment that William Afton's agony infected many different items. You learn that this is where many of the Fazbear Frights stories get their origin, because it's in this moment that a lot of objects are turned into things that will kill someone. A perfect example being Fetch. It's a dog toy animatronic thing that essentially syncs up to your phone, and if you want something, it will get it for you, and if it perceives anything as a threat to you, it killed them on sight. Well, the Fetch that was possessed by William Afton's agony did, anyway. So that's one thing. Is that all that we get from William Afton? No, but before we move on, what of that small boy we saw in the hospital? Well, that, my friends, is Andrew, and him and someone else have a full section dedicated to themselves. Specifically talking about the Man in Room 1280, it's explained that this body's brain has two blips inside of it when they scan it. Essentially, there seems to be two consciousnesses within this corpse, one of them being William Afton, and the other one being Andrew. We hear directly from Andrew later on that although he can't remember why, he hated this man so much that he did everything in his power to keep him alive and torture him for as long as he could. There should be alarm bells going off in your head if there aren't already. This is a pretty direct description of Ultimate Custom Night. The idea of the spirit of one of William Afton's victims keeping him alive longer than he should be, specifically to torture him in a room of their own making. Oh man, Mark is shedding so much, and my nose and eyes are dying. We're getting close to summer, they're gonna start shedding even more. This kind of explains something I myself had been confused on for quite some time. I thought Ultimate Custom Night took place in some kind of weird purgatory realm that the Vengeful Spirit created, just a weird space bubble of spirits and stuff. But whether or not the Man in Room 1280 is directly connected to the games, this method is definitely how Ultimate Custom Night happens. It's showing us that UCN isn't some weird purgatory realm, it's taking place within the mind of William Afton. The Vengeful Spirit is using Afton's memories and their own memories against him. They don't exist within some ethereal space, they just exist within William's mind. So again, is this the end of William Afton's involvement in Fazbear Frights? He explodes and that's it? Of course it isn't. William Afton can't die even when he literally explodes into goo. because that goo went on to possess several different artifacts. In the Fazbear Frights epilogues, the Stitchwraith's main goal is to collect as many of these agony-infected objects as it can and throw them into a trash compactor to try and destroy it. However, all this does is help William Afton, because they're collecting these scattered objects and mashing them all into one big thing. Once enough of it is there, William just takes control of it as this huge amalgamation. But before he's able to do too much collateral damage, he is defeated quite quickly. Once he's in one piece again, the detective trying to make sense of all of this is on the case, and he takes the evidence that he brought with him, a broken puppet mask that had been mentally begging him to do so, and throws it into this giant 15-foot behemoth. He also tries to forklift it into a lake. Yes, God, there's another lake. But regardless, those pieces of the marionette had a spirit attached, and once inside this agony-infused behemoth of a beast, it takes control and then forces it to rip itself apart and sink into that lake, hopefully to never be heard from again. The implications of this are massive. If the stories take place in the game's timeline, or if in this universe Charlotte still possesses the puppet, this would be another example of Charlotte defeating William Afton, being the one to do it, and then drowning him in a goddamned lake. And if you don't know why I'm so weirded out by this, I literally made an entire video about all the references we have to Golden Freddy and drowning and red lakes. Not to mention, and I brought this up in a podcast a couple podcasts ago, but it was brought up to me in comments, I totally forgot. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC in Help Wanted is literally next to a red lake surrounded by dying trees in which a Dreadbear walks out of. You know, a Frankenstein of different pieces that looks like an agony beast. Does William get out of the lake? Maybe. But as far as the books go, he doesn't. However, even though William Afton seems to be out of the count for the rest of these epilogues, his agony continues in another character, Eleanor. Eleanor. Before I read these books, legitimately the most I knew about Eleanor was that she was Tall Circus Baby, and that one copy pasta that's like, Eleanor is very real and very powerful and is coming to the games, which was a good meme. But now that I've read it, I know everything there is to know about Eleanor, which isn't that much, to be honest. We get a lot of information about Eleanor and the abilities she has in Fazbear Frights, but we get like little to no information, as far as I'm aware, on where Eleanor comes from. We don't know who built her or how she ended up in a dump. We just know that she's a tall and slender version of Circus Baby, and that many people perceive her to be incredibly beautiful. I think she's even called a supermodel at some point. She's also always wearing a silver heart pendant, except for one story where she gives it to a girl for a couple days, but she gets it back by the end. However, this tall and slender and beautiful form isn't necessarily confirmed to be her true form. In fact, it's implied that this is a disguise that the pendant is helping her do. When the detective on the case of the Stitchwraith finds Eleanor and examines her, he sees a skeletal face with thin, diseased skin stretched over a skull, and impossibly wide mouth and deep-set eyes. It looks really off-putting. This could be Eleanor's true form that she's disguising using that pendant with remnant in it, but if that's true, then you would think she would look like that for all of To Be Beautiful when she's not wearing the pendant. It's not entirely clear. Although that form could just be when she's under the effects of massive amounts of agony, too. Oh yeah, that's what she's doing, by the way. Throughout all of the Fazbear Fright stories and the epilogues, Eleanor is amassing as much agony as she possibly can, and killing people for it and with it. We see her give the detective visions of her doing many of the horrific deaths in Fazbear Frights. She also helps William Afton form into that amalgamation, but it is notable that once she's defeated, she's seen just sneaking off, and it doesn't seem like she actually cared about William Afton, just really wanted the agony he possessed. But agony isn't all she's after. The latter half of the Stitchwraith stingers see Eleanor tricking the Stitchwraith into letting her get in access with the one scientist who has a lot of remnant, Dr. Talbert. She's trying and eventually does become a being made out of pure remnant and agony. And give credit where the credit's due to the meme, she is incredibly powerful in this state. But the major question with all of this, what does this mean for the games? Is she a character in the games we're going to encounter? It's possible, but even if Eleanor never appears in any FNAF game ever, her presence in the books is still incredibly important to learn about the effects of remnant and agony. Although more specifically agony. Eleanor does some wild shit, especially when she's this being of remnant and agony. But in that state, it's not incredibly clear what abilities are being caused by what source. But for the majority of the story, she is a being of almost entirely agony with a remnant pendant around her neck. So does she do anything while specifically being this being of agony? Yeah, bro, it doesn't show up on camera. There's literally Mark fur floating as a cloud around me. I can barely see. I'm rubbing my nose in between every other sentence. Mark, I love you, but look at all the... I literally scratched your back for like 2 seconds. My hand is covered in fur. I brush him every day. Summer coats, man. Mainly, we know she has the ability to suck the agony out of an artifact or anything similar, and then absorb that agony into herself. She does this to the Stitchwraith during that big fight with Afton, and then seemingly leaves the Stitchwraith to only be powered by Remnant. She's also the one that has the ability I mentioned in the last video, where she's able to trap people within the worst memories that she can create or bring up, either of her victim or of herself. Whereas Remnant is able to do this with positive emotions and help people find peace, she's able to expand the negative emotions and memories in people to trap them in their own mind. Again, similar to what we see Ultimate Custom Night truly being. So that's Eleanor, and there is more to her character and what she does in the books, but that's as far as relevant information for the games that I can think of. So what about that thing I keep mentioning every other sentence, the Stitchwraith? The Stitchwraith is that thing I mentioned in the last video, where Phineas Taggart took an endoskeleton, filled it with as much agony as he possibly could, and then put the battery of the fetch dog and the mask of the Simon doll onto it, creating the Stitchwraith. But have you noticed what I keep saying? He gives it intelligence by giving it 2 items, the mask of the Simon doll and the battery of the fetch toy. And in doing so, probably unknowingly, Taggart gave the Stitchwraith 2 intelligences, a boy named Andrew and a boy named Jake. Jake was a 9-year-old boy with PNET, or primitive neuroectodermal tumor. It's a rare form of cancer typically found in the brain. He'd been fighting it for 3 years, but was severely weakened and bedridden because of it. Jake's mother was dead and his father was overseas in the war, so his father and his caretaker Margie came up with a plan so he wouldn't get lonely. They created a doll named Simon. They made it so Jake could have a friend, and it lived in the cabinet in his room, but he couldn't see it. He asked to see it, but the promise was when Jake is well enough to get up and open the cabinet, he can finally meet Simon. And every night he would talk to Simon and Simon would talk back. He would say he didn't do much, but then Simon would say, "Oh, what did the real Jake do?" And then Jake would go off on these wild tangents of what he wanted to do that day. What was really happening was that Jake's father, who's overseas in the war, was talking through the Simon doll with an audio connection, and he was pretending to be Simon to keep Jake positive. This went all right for a time, but Jake still wasn't making much progress. In fact, his symptoms started getting worse. Eventually, though, Jake's father dies in the war. Margie isn't sure what to tell him and just says that Simon can't visit that night, to Jake's disappointment. That night, Margie hears strange voices coming from the Simon doll, but by the time she gets there, it's silent. And the next morning, Jake is even worse than before. The call is finally made to have Jake be moved to hospice care to help him on his way out. But before the ambulance even arrives, Jake dies. And while everyone is grieving and mourning, no one notices that the cabinet Simon was in is open, and Simon is nowhere to be found. Notably, one of the last things Jake says is, "I don't want to pretend anymore." So the implication being, he then possesses the Simon doll, and he's not pretending to be the real Jake anymore, he's living out that life as this doll. Somehow, someway, this doll ends up in the hands of Phineas Taggart, and it's the mask from this doll that is placed on the Stitchwraith, the goal being giving the endoskeleton some sort of personality and mind. And within the Stitchwraith, Jake is able to see everything around him and fully control the endoskeleton. But he's not alone, because he's sharing the endoskeleton with a boy named Andrew. We know much less about Andrew. Technically, we don't even know anything about his life. We only know what he's done after he died. That being, he's the boy from the man in room 1280. The little boy with the black curly hair and the alligator mask that is inside of William Afton's brain, and when William Afton explodes, Andrew goes into the fetch toy. But sometime after that story, the fetch toy is left in a thunderstorm and breaks down, and then it ends up down the line at Phineas Taggart's lab. The battery from that toy is what's chosen to be the heart of the endoskeleton. And Andrew is now in the Stitchwraith, but while in the Stitchwraith, he cannot see or hear anything of the outside world. However, whenever the Stitchwraith touches somebody, they die instantly. And it's Andrew's idea that it's his agony and anger towards the man in room 1280 that's causing this. Jake thinks it's something else entirely that came along with the endoskeleton. Andrew is almost certain that it's his doing. Not on purpose, it's just happening because of him. Interestingly enough, it's most likely that Andrew is right here. Part of the agony on the Stitchwraith is William Afton because of Fetch. That plus all of the other agony is surely to make a potent combination. So that's who Andrew and Jake are, and they turn into the Stitchwraith. Jake immediately resolves to find all of these agony objects that are causing people suffering, collect them, and destroy them. And that's what the Stitchwraith stingers show us them doing. And as the Stitchwraith, they're possibly the biggest debate of this entire Fazbear Frights series. Why? Well, there's two major camps. One side believe that Andrew and Jake and the Stitchwraith are all characters directly from the Five Nights at Freddy's games that we're getting the information of in the books, and this is what happens after FNAF 6 and after Ultimate Custom Night, Andrew being the one that created Ultimate Custom Night. The other camp believes these characters are meant to inform us about characters that we already have some evidence of existing within the games, and that Andrew, Jake, and the Stitchwraith by extension are not in the game timeline. So what's correct? For the longest time, I had a bit where I would always say, if I'm in the FNAF movie and I hear the name Andrew, I'm walking out. It's over. Admittedly, after reading all of Fazbear Frights, I am more open to the idea of Stitchline games. I personally don't believe in it. Personally, I do think Andrew and Jake are meant to inform us about characters we already have some evidence of in-game. But I admit, it's honestly hard to say definitively either way. The main reason I'm against Stitchline games is the lack of in-game evidence for Andrew and Jake. We just literally have none as far as I'm aware, where we at least have definite evidence of one of the characters that matches up and arguable evidence of the other one. So I hear you. If Andrew and Jake aren't in the games, what are the characters that these kids line up with that can teach us about these other characters we already have? Who the hell am I talking about? Well, I think that Andrew and Jake are here to teach us more about the Crying Child and the Vengeful Spirit, because Andrew and Jake match very well to those characters. Jake is a really good stand-in for the Crying Child. Granted, Jake is not in Afton, and he has much more agency than the Crying Child ever did, but they're both sickly, timid kids. Both of them spend time at a hospital due to an issue with their head, Jake being Peanut and the Crying Child being the Bite of 83, and here's the really big one that I think solidifies a connection here. Jake talks to a small toy companion that talks back to him, but the talkback is actually his father pretending to be that toy. If Jake is meant to be teaching us something about the Crying Child, I think it's this. I think it's telling us that the Crying Child's Fredbear plush is William Afton. Because after all, that would be a toy that the Crying Child talks to, but secretly, his father is using a technological device to talk back to him. It's so close, it's crazy. But here's the thing I should specify. I'm not arguing that those who think Jake is in the games think that Jake is the Crying Child. Sure, some people do, but personally, I don't think if Jake is in the games, then he would be the Crying Child. There are certain things that don't line up. For one, Jake isn't in Afton. His father is away in the war, and William Afton's a draft dodger, so that just doesn't make sense. And after the fight with the Afton amalgamation and Eleanor, the Stitchwraith loses all of its agony and Andrew in the process, and Jake takes up sort of a protagonist role, something that I don't see the Crying Child ever really doing. I think if Jake is in the games, him and the Crying Child would be two separate entities. That being said, I do think that what Jake does at the end of the Stitchwraith epilogues is indicative of what Charlotte does to create FNAF World. So the Stitchwraith's final actions after all the fights have been settled is seeking out a ball pit that it can sense multiple trapped souls within. And it gets there and it's the Into the Pit ball pit. When it falls in, it starts seeing all these memories of different people who are tormented by their past. It's essentially a ball pit of agony. While in there, Jake uses his remnant to find the positive memories in these spirits' afterlives and amplify them, remind them of the good times, and slowly but surely all these spirits find peace. It isn't said that they move on, but they can at least rest easily now. And I think this is indicative of what Charlotte does with FNAF World. After the FNAF 6 fire, Charlotte is going through the various spirits still here and trying to amplify their positive memories to help them find peace. So if Jake is the Crying Child, why is Andrew the Vengeful Spirit? Well, obviously because Andrew's doing Ultimate Custom Night in the Fazbear Frights books. Close the book, shut it, done and done. But besides that, he is genuinely a very vengeful spirit. He's incredibly spiteful and angry towards William Afton, and he's attached himself to William Afton. So, alright, if Andrew is meant to be the vengeful spirit, but Andrew isn't in the games, then what is Andrew's character trying to tell us about the vengeful spirit? Well, there's one part about Andrew that is technically speculation, but it is very evidence-backed, and I haven't brought it up until now for dramatic effect, and that's his suspected cause of death. In the story The New Kid, a teenager gets trapped in the mouth of the Fredbear, the Golden Freddy springlock suit, looking for a friend they pranked and thought died in there. And as he's dying, he finally gets deep enough to see the innermost chamber of the stomach of Fredbear, and he finds a corpse, but it's not the corpse he was looking for. This corpse is described to have short, black, curly hair. Why is this important? In The Man in Room 1280, Andrew is described as having short, black, curly hair. I think this might be trying to imply that the reason Andrew can't remember of why he hates William Afton so much is William Afton killed Andrew using a springlock suit, unlike the other victims. Okay, why is that important? Well, I mentioned that video earlier I made about the whole Golden Freddy drowning in Red Lake thing, and I couldn't figure out what it meant. At the time I was thinking, okay, maybe this is trying to tell us that William drowned the vengeful spirit and that's why, but drowning doesn't make sense, where would he have done that, yada yada yada. A lot of people in the comments pointed something out to me that I completely forgot. In The Silver Eyes, the first novel, William describes how it feels to die by springlock. Let's check that passage again, specifically the end of it. Quote, "You'll try to scream, but you'll be unable to. Your vocal cords will be severed, and your lungs will fill with your own blood until you drown in it." Having a character drown in a red lake is a pretty damn good metaphor for having your lungs fill with blood. This, along with Andrew being killed in the springlock suit of Golden Freddy, is really good evidence for the vengeful spirit to be the vengeful spirit, because unlike the other children, they were killed by being put into the springlock Golden Freddy suit. That's why Golden Freddy is twitching at the end of Ultimate Custom Night. The vengeful spirit is reminding William why he's here. He's here because he did that to the vengeful spirit. The vengeful spirit is playing its own death center stage in William Afton's mind. And honestly, I think that explains why Dreadbear leaves the lake in the DLC. We only see Fredbear entering the lake and drowning, but after the result of the drowning caused by Fredbear, the result was a twisted, agony-fueled beast, the vengeful spirit. So again, I totally understand the camp of people who fully believe Andrew and Jake and the Stitchwraith are just in the games. That is the lore. But keep in mind, if The Man in Room 1280 and the Stitchwraith and all of those epilogues are directly canon to the game's timeline, that would also include several other Fazbear Frights stories, at least the ones that feature the items being collected in the epilogues. And Into the Pit, because the ball pit. But then again, Into the Pit is going to be made into a game, so theoretically it will be a canon thing. So, I don't know. Maybe? But in my opinion, right now, before the release of Into the Pit, where we don't really know what that's going to tell us yet besides just the book again, as far as games that are currently released, to my knowledge, we have absolutely no evidence of Andrew or Jake existing, outside of one sprite of a character in an alligator mask, which is frankly not strong enough for me. We have plenty of evidence of the crying child existing, and you could argue the vengeful spirit could just be Andrew, sure. But I think the vengeful spirit is Cassidy. And I think the security logbook, which is the closest connection we have directly, does show us the name Cassidy linking itself to everything else going on. Not to mention the Princess Quest file that got changed. And I know, that's incredibly small evidence, but it is evidence. And I think that would fill the role of what Scott hoped these books would do. To quote another post by him, lots of the later stories will answer some of the biggest questions from the fanbase over this past year, in my opinion. That's what I think. I think Andrew and Jake are meant to answer questions we have, not just fill in new lore we didn't know about. So, do we make it? I gave all my opinions on what lore from the Fazbear Frights books are most important in the game's timelines. I think so. And look, like I said, it's totally valid to assume every epilogue in the connected stories are directly canon to the games. Hell, it's totally valid to just think all of Fazbear Frights are canon to the games. That's your prerogative and you're welcome to do it. But personally, I don't until proven otherwise. But if you did miss last week's video, that went all into Remnant and Agony and other forms of possession that we see in the Fazbear Fazbear Frights books, and you can check it out right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to use #RightTart. A huge shout out to the best shadow members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.